Good morning, students. Today we're going to go over our module on childhood obesity. And before I begin the lecture for today, I just wanted to go over some of the quick things that are posted on this week's module. Also, we have our first main documentary, The Weight of the Nation, Children in Crisis Part 3, that is posted on this module. So I wanted to make sure that we navigated through it together so knew exactly what to expect before we jumped into the content. As you notice, some of the important information about this module is posted right here. In addition to that, we have an introduction, accompanying lecture slides about childhood obesity. And if you've been noticing, if there are any edits that I make to the lecture slides, I go ahead and repost the updated lecture on that day. However, I make sure that everything is available the week of, just so if you wanted to study in advance, you have all of that information available to you. Edits are usually very minor, like deadlines and due dates, and none of the content is usually changed. So in that aspect, it's safe for you to go ahead and save those if you chose to do so. Remember that we have, like I said, our main documentary that is posted in this week, which is called The Weight of the Nation, Children in Crisis. Now it is a little lengthy, it's about an hour, but it's definitely well worth your time. The link has been posted in D2L for you to view the entire documentary at your own time. And once you're done with that, I encourage you all to participate in this discussion post for childhood obesity. Now, discussion post. The following discussion posts from number 2 till number 5, they are used for bonus point opportunities. You will get 5 bonus points if you choose to participate in this, so it is not mandatory. However, in order to get a really good understanding of the content material, I encourage you to finish watching the documentary and then participate in the discussion post. That way you can get your 5 bonus points and you have gone through all of these additional questions, which may be helpful for you to understand this content for the exam. It is important to know that the documentary itself is not optional to watch. Everyone must watch it because the content from it, such as case studies, specific content, will be on the exam. The only optional part is the discussion post. And remember, it's for 5 bonus points altogether, and you can participate in 2 bonus discussion posts to get a total of 10 bonus points. I also have, right after the discussion post, 2 journal articles that are posted. These are to be read at your own time. You must take notes on them. One of them is an official peer-reviewed journal article, which is Article 1, that is on the parenting styles and obesity risks in children. The second one is more like a report, which is optional. It is from the National Center on Child Care Quality Improvement that talks about the prevention efforts on childhood obesity. Again, this is to increase your exposure on the content and is optional, which means I will not have direct questions from it on the exam, but I encourage you to go through it as well. Followed with our conclusion, and then as always, there's a checklist that's been posted. I can see which students go back and complete the checklist and which students do not. I'm noticing that there's a lot of students who are lagging behind in completing their checklist for each module. So make sure that you do that. And again, this is a great way. It's a tool for you, created for you to make sure that you have gone through everything in that content so that you're keeping yourself up to date as far as the course content is concerned. Again, I encourage you to go through it after you've completed the entire module, to use this as a way to evaluate yourself. That being said, I think I've gone through everything that I wanted to in this module as far as navigation is concerned. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with our lecture for today. Module 6, again, is focused on childhood obesity. And I hope that by now you have watched your documentary, The Weight of the Nation, Children in Crisis. Remember, the discussion questions are posted in discussion post number 2. And that is a bonus point opportunity for 5 points total. After watching the documentary, I wanted to touch upon some very key points before we jumped into our content for this lecture. And some of the points that are noticed were that children in general are getting heavier and more obese, and that obesity rate is increasing globally, all over the world. We see children from all parts of the world, Western and non-Western, first world countries, third world countries, that are all seeing this rise in the rate of childhood obesity. And a lot of that, and that was also briefly touched upon in the documentary, has to do with finding access to best quality foods. So even if you just look at within the East Texas area, or if you wanted to be more specific, looking at the Nacogdoches community, the best quality foods that we find are often more expensive. Shopping for foods that are organic or, farmers market products or locally grown, non-GMO, and all of these additional qualities, they're more expensive to purchase rather than a store's generic brands. I wanted to take an example of, a tray of eggs, a dozen eggs, and how exactly does the price really compare in different markets and in different locations. So if you were to buy, a dozen eggs at the Nacogdoches Farmers Market, it would cost around $5. Now, if you were to go and buy the same tray of eggs, organic, from a grocery store such as a Super Walmart or Kroger or even Berkshire Brothers, it would cost you between $4.74 to $6.15. Again, this depends on, if it's organic generic brand or if it's, organic name brand. So there's a little bit of variation in price right there. However, if you wanted to buy a non-organic, simple, generic store brand of eggs, for example, Great Value, right? That would cost you about $2.50. So if you notice, from the first option to the last option, there's such a huge difference in price variation. And it may not seem that huge right now because we're looking at $2.50, but just imagine having to do a monthly grocery where the more higher quality food is almost twice as expensive versus the lower quality food that has about, that is not as expensive. That often makes the choice of purchasing higher quality foods very difficult for some of the families, especially for those who are on a budget. To touch upon those key topics here, in order to really comprehend childhood obesity, we really have to understand the definition of obesity and how that really compares between children and adults. Obesity is defined by the term BMI, which stands for basal metabolic index. And that particular, measure, BMI rate, is actually used for both youth and adults. However, the way we use it for youth and adults is a little bit different. So, and among adults, there's a really set cut point that is based on health risk. And the BMI rate is set on 30. A BMI of 30 or higher is usually considered as overweight or obese, and lower is considered healthier. Whereas among children, the definition is a little bit different because it's based on statistical measures. And how so? So based on the child's weight, you can put them on a comparison scale with the reference population. And the comparison scales are two different ones. There is one that is height versus weight, and then there's the other one that is age versus weight. If you remember from the documentary, The Weight of the Nation, all 4 case studies of children that were shown in the film, they were measured, their weight was measured and then put on the scale that compared them to to the entire reference population based on their age and based on their height. So 2 different types of statistical measures. Now, the second question is, what BMI is accepted for children and adolescents? A BMI below 95th percentile, based on the age and the sex-specific growth charts that are provided from CDC, states the following. And again, this data is from 2000, so it's not too old. It's still very relevant. But between the 90th and the 95th percentile, we classify that as overweight. Above the 95th percentile is classified as obesity, and usually translate into a BMI of 30 that is considered the threshold as well for children who are right there at the borderline of 17 and 18-year-old and are about to transition into adulthood. I also wanted to touch upon some data and statistics. So, has it always been like this as far as childhood obesity is concerned? And the answer is no. If you look at data and go back a few decades, let's go back to 1970s. The count for childhood obesity was not as high as it is today. In fact, nationally speaking, the rate of childhood obesity in American children was about 5%. Whereas if you fast forward 40 years, by 2010, we had increased that rate to about 17%. That's an increase of about 12% within 4 decades. So this translates into several changes that have occurred in the last 4 decades. We're looking at differences in our diets, in our lifestyles, in our living conditions, specifically families' shopping patterns, food habits. We're looking at changes at school lunch menus. Also, we have to incorporate the physical activity factors. We're becoming a nation of spectators, which means we like to play video games, we like to watch shows rather than becoming more physically active. And not having higher levels of physical activity also contributes to childhood obesity levels. Statistically speaking, again, numbers wise, childhood obesity affects about 12.7 million children and adolescents. And that's again a very big number. It was not always this way. I also wanted to talk about the racial and the ethnic correlations of our society with childhood obesity and how exactly do are those divided based on different racial groups, based on different ethnicities. So this data that I'm providing to you is from CDC of childhood obesity into the four biggest minorities or four biggest racial subgroups within America. And based on that, then they have, and based on that, we see four groups that come into play: Hispanic American, non-Hispanic African American, non-Hispanic Caucasian American, and then non-Hispanic Asian. And we're able to see which group has the highest prevalence rate of childhood obesity. Among the Hispanic American group, we see a childhood obesity rate of about 21.9%, followed with non-Hispanic African American group that has a childhood obesity rate of about 19.5%, non-Hispanic Caucasian American with about 14.7% childhood obesity rate, and then the lowest rate is found in the non-Hispanic Asian subgroup with about 8.9%. Now, this term, even though it's the Asian subgroup, it includes several groups. It includes the East Asian, Central Asian, South Asian. All of those groups are added, subgroups are added in this one category. So that really lets you see that how exactly race impacts the prevalence rate and the incidence rate of childhood obesity between the biggest minorities in America. I also wanted to look at the age-wise distribution of childhood obesity. So just like with our previous lecture, what I've done is divided the entire time period from childhood and adolescence into three age brackets. And this data really lets us see what exactly differs from one age bracket to the next one and why are the childhood obesity rates different. Now, before I jump into that content, I wanted to let you guys know that CDC came up with this document that is known as Healthy People 2020 that marked out the goal of childhood obesity to be about 14.5%. That, in comparison with our overall rate of 17%, was a really good goal. However, what we notice is that prevalence rate, even now, is much higher than the CDC goal. So let's look at the rates as per age group. Among the 2 to 5-year-olds, we see an overall childhood obesity rate of 8.9%. When you transition into this next age group, among 6 to 11-year-olds, now remember those are your school-age children. They've started school, first grade, up until elementary, or you're ending elementary at that point in time. And then look at how the childhood obesity rates compare. From 8.9%, we're looking at 17.5%. That's an overall 8.6% increase from the previous age group. Furthermore, in the next age bracket, when children are, kind of leaving the childhood age phase and stepping into the adolescence, and then into teenage years, so from 12 to 19 years old, we see an overall childhood obesity rate of 20.5%, and that's again another 3% increase. So the only subgroup of children that met the CDC goal was the children between the ages of 2 to 5 that had a childhood obesity rate that was a lot lower than their actual goal. There are a lot of things to consider over here. What has happened as far as the food habits are concerned, as far as the family living standards are concerned, as far as the environment is concerned, the school lunches are concerned, that has changed from this subgroup to this subgroup. And then furthermore, as children are getting older, are we seeing a pattern where those habits are solidified? Perhaps the habits are deteriorating and we're making even worse choices as far as foods are concerned, that this percentage is increased. Although not as much, we still see an increase in the rate of childhood obesity. I also wanted to give you a prevalence graph of childhood obesity based on sex and age. So in this graph, what we see is the overall prevalence rate of obesity that is at about 17%, and that is something that we've already established in the earlier part of our lecture. The rate is pretty consistent between both male and female children and adolescents, and there's no difference in trends as far as gender is concerned. Now, we do know that the consistency shows a problem that is rooted in each child's lifestyle from very early on. However, that is not the case in adult obesity, where females do show a greater prevalence rate. So, a really good way to understand everything that we talked about is looking at this graph, looking at the color codes, where the dark blue bar represents age from 2 to 19 years. So, it's the entire childhood and adolescence age group. And then furthermore, it divides the content into these three subgroups where the lighter blue represents 2 to 5 years. So you see it dropping down. Then the green one represents children between the ages of 6 to 11 years old. So that increase. So if you look right here, all males and female children and adolescents. From 2 to 5, we see an 8.9% increase in relatively similar numbers in both males and females as well. And then that shoots up to 17.5% when we look at all children. And the same, it's pretty consistent with male and female. And then the similar pattern between the children of 12 to 19 years of age. I also wanted to look at again or provide you with the childhood obesity prevalence rates graph that was based on race and ethnicity. So even though we talked about those numbers in our previous slide right here, I also wanted to give you a graph because for me, I learn a lot better when there's a visual that goes along with the content. So if it's difficult for you to remember the numbers this way, I encourage you to look at the graph. And the same thing is shown through this graph, which talks about racial distribution of obesity across 4 different racial subgroups. We do see the highest prevalence rate in males in Hispanic and non-Hispanic Asian groups. So if you look at right here, it's divided into males here, females here. The Hispanic Asian group is this gray bar right here, and you see the highest prevalence rate in the Hispanic male children and adolescents at about 22.4%, and just slightly lower in Hispanic female children and adolescents at about 21.4%. Overall, we do see the lowest rate of obesity among the non-Hispanic Asian groups at 8.6% right here, which is the non-Hispanic Asian is the green bar, which is, and over here we actually do see differences as far as gender is concerned. So overall speaking, it's an 8.6% rate. However, when you look at males, the obesity rate actually increases to about 11.8%, and in females to about 5.3%. So based on both gender and ethnicity, we're looking at non-Hispanic Asian females that have the lowest rate of childhood and adolescence obesity. I also wanted to talk about the physical health consequences now that we've gone through the epidemiology, the prevalence, and the incidence rates. So overall, we found out, if you remember from the earlier slides, let's go back real quick. Childhood obesity impacts about 12.7 million, childhood obesity impacts about 12.7 million children and adolescents each year. When we talk about the physical health consequences, I'd like to add a little note though, because this particular statistics includes both children and adolescents. So we can't necessarily say from that 12.7 million, children and adolescents, 2.6 of them die each year. No, that would be incorrect representation because this statistic includes both children and adolescents. Now let's go ahead and talk about the most common physical consequences. There are several, and I mean there are several, but what I've done in this slide is try to really extract the highlights and the key common physical consequences. So the first one being cardiovascular disease, and the 2 most common forms of cardiovascular diseases that we do see that actually initiate or have an onset even in childhood, that is heart diseases and stroke, leading to complete myocardial infarction that does occur in late adolescence or even in early adulthood. We also see diabetes type 2. Now, a little bit of history on diabetes type 2. If you remember from the documentary, The Weight of the Nation, this diagnosis was not very common in, let's say in the 80s or the 90s. But all of a sudden, we see a very high prevalence rate and incidence rate of diabetes type 2 that is occurring in children. And that definitely has to do with our growing obesity rates, our our diets that continue to evolve, family living situations, our environment, all of those are contributing to that. And as a result, we see this diagnosis that is much more common now among children and adolescents. We also see how it impacts other body functions, so in form of musculoskeletal disorders, especially in osteoarthritis. We also see an increased prevalence rates of cancer among children, specifically endometrial cancer, breast cancer down the road, or even colon cancer. There's also higher chances of premature death from childhood obesity or developing a full disability during adulthood. Now, all of those are very significant physical consequences, but here is that is really, really worrisome, and that is that children who do become obese at an early stage of their life tend to stay that way or tend to stay obese during adulthood. So because if that statistic plays a role in every child's life, then we're not necessarily increasing just childhood obesity rate, but also adult obesity rate at the same time. I also wanted to talk about this concept of double burden. This was also briefly touched upon in the documentary, and it was referred to as a double whammy from one of the public health practitioners. But this is a situation where both conditions of undernutrition and obesity coexist in one person. And it basically occurs through eating foods that are really high in fat, salt, and sugar content. And it's also because they also have no nutritional value to them. And it includes high energy foods or energy dense foods that have no nutritional value, such as a Big Mac meal, a tub of French fries. So you really are not getting any nutrition out of it, but just calories. Energy dense food doesn't necessarily cover a large variety of food groups on the food pyramid. So as a result, you are consuming food, you are consuming calories, but they're not necessarily providing you with any nutrition. And that concept is called double burden. There are some very definite risk factors of double burden, and I wanted to expand on those as well. Let's talk about them first. So the socioeconomic background, families who belong to a lower income, they definitely have difficulty in finding access to high quality, affordable foods. And oftentimes not having access to that makes it difficult for families to find foods or to include foods in their diet that are higher in quality more often. We're also looking at poor nutrition consumption during the prenatal years and how that kind of really formulates a pattern for the infant and even during the childhood years, which then determines their overall eating habits as they get a little older, during adolescence, and even during adulthood. We're also looking at exposure to high fat and energy dense micronutrient poor foods. And again, that exposure could occur early on in a child's life during the school age years, which is where we again see a spike in childhood obesity, or even during adolescence. And all of that combined with lack of physical activity during early childhood and adolescent years. And again, this lack of physical activity is not necessarily just coming with a choice of the child or the parent not really reinforcing that into their lifestyle, but a greater question or a deeper question is, does the family or the child have access to locations where they could perform physical activity? So, having access to parks, having access to walking pathways, biking pathways, to the school, and nearby locations where you could walk. All of that comes into play when we talk about lack of physical activity. So I wanted to expand on some of those examples a little bit further. So lower socioeconomic background, where families only have access to cheaper foods. And those cheaper foods are often lower in quality. So an example would be drive-through of a fast food restaurant. And any family would engage into that habit or, would utilize that option when there is a budget and when higher quality foods like fruits and vegetables are more expensive than the dollar menu at McDonald's. And in fact, this particular situation was filmed in a documentary called Food Inc., where a family talked about their difficulties in choosing higher quality foods, and the reason being a broccoli head was more expensive than the dollar menu at McDonald's, and when they had to feed 5 people in their family, it made the choice a lot, it was pretty evident in what they had to do in order to keep the family fed rather than choosing to having the higher quality food. I also wanted to expand on maternal health and food consumption during prenatal years. Eating habits that are formed during infant and childhood phases, such as, consumption of formula, such as consumption of juices, sugary foods, and beverages, all of that really impacts by forming a feeding pattern, a eating pattern that doesn't necessarily stop just at that age. It actually continues during childhood, during adolescence, and even during adulthood. And they all have a direct correlation with this incidence of childhood obesity. Even during maternal health, the kind of foods that the mother consumes during the prenatal years not only impacts her child's health, but also her health down the road. So making sure that during those months of pregnancy, the mother is engaging in healthier behavior, she's eating healthier, higher quality foods, she's also exercising regularly to make sure that her health is restored and that she's able to pass that on to the children as well. Our location, like I said earlier, also makes a huge difference. I talked about this phrase, the zip code determines your destiny, and I actually caught that phrase from one of the documentaries that was on YouTube about how where we live kind of pretty much determined everything from what kind of access we had to schools to kind of jobs that were around, that floated around in that area to the kind of living you are going to make. And one of those examples is, having access to parks, physical activity options. Perhaps is there a rec center in your area that has reduced prices for children's programs? Are there developed walking pathways for school? All of those are things to consider and come into play when we look at how our location makes a huge difference as far as access to parks and physical activity is concerned. I also wanted to look at mental health consequences. So one of the biggest mental health consequences for childhood obesity is of being afflicted with a lower self-esteem, a lower self-concept due to a body shape discontentment. And oftentimes, because of that, children become victim to bullies on school campuses. We also see that children may become bullies themselves, to satisfy this need to feel superior, more powerful, and validated. We also see that how it impacts children when there is a parental preference for thinner children, or when there's a constant comparison or a direct public criticism of a child's weight. Comparison could be with, siblings, with cousins, with other friends who are thin, and how that really impacts the child, contributes to their lower self-esteem and lower self-concept, and thus, strengthens this body shape discontentment. We also see symptoms of depression that are very evident in children and adolescents who are suffering from childhood obesity, and those may be expressed in different ways. It could be expressed in the form of a frustration, anger, and aggressive behavior, conduct problems, bullying, either becoming a victim or, being the bully themselves. And all of this is, stems from this guilt that the child has regarding food, regarding food choices, regarding weight gain, food consumption. And the way I like to phrase it is regarding fighting the bite and their ability to successfully do that sometimes and then not being able to do that sometimes. All of that kind of builds this negative relationship that the child has or develops with food at an early age, where they start to look at food in a negative connotation because a lot of their mental health problems that they suffer from that due to that item. We also see possible development of eating disorders. It's rather common where children who do suffer from childhood obesity, when they do make those choices, when they do make, when they do so we also see possible development of other eating disorders when children who do change lifestyle patterns, eating patterns, kind of go from one extreme to the other, where when they were, making choices for unhealthy foods, very commonly now they're kind of completely restricting all kinds of foods, which is again another extreme that is not very healthy. So, they're going from obesity to developing eating disorders such as bulimia nervosa, anorexia nervosa, and neither one of those are healthy for them. And again, this is occurring because they have this negative relationship from food, and they look at food in that negative connotation where at one point they're consuming lots of it, unhealthy options, and then in another extreme they're not consuming any at all. And of course, in either conditions, your body is not going to thrive. Some of the other mental health consequences that we look at is developing sleep problems. You see shorter durations of sleep, so not necessarily sleeping the full 6 to 7 hours, 7 to 8 hours, whatever the need may be. and also development of sleep apnea, which can occur when there is a blockage in your upper respiratory airway, and that blockage starts to repeat over and over, which reduces your airflow or completely stops it. It also impacts sleep apnea and sleeper duration. Shorter sleep durations also impact the focus and the attitude overall for the child. So all of those are tied in sort of together. We also see how social skills are diminished, and there is difficulties where the child finds a difficulty in engage in a social situation, engage with peers, and really be able to take advantage of those social relationships at an early age. And then lastly but not least, we see the formulations of suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts that start to occur where a child really starts to feel that a lot of that is happening is their fault and that there's no way to control that. And when there's this feeling of hopelessness, lack of control that they feel, we start to see suicidal ideations and even suicide attempts. So overall, what contributes to this epidemic? I would like to say some of the developmental factors during the early life of the child. And again, that comes down to the family's food habits. Is the family engaging in healthier food choices like cooking dinner at home or versus eating out? So even in eating out, it definitely includes several options. It could be going through the drive-through more often versus eating healthier foods like a salad or wraps, whole grain foods, things like that. So not saying that eating out there's anything wrong with that as long as it's done in moderation. But even within that option, you have healthier choices. So the question to ask is the family engaging in those healthier options? So we also have to look at parenting and how that plays a role. We talked about authoritative, permissive, uninvolved, authoritarian, four different types of parenting styles. And each one of them were measured with two scales, the level of demandingness and the level of responsiveness. Within authoritative, if you remember from our previous lecture, we had high demandingness and high responsiveness. Whereas permissive, the parent often had trouble asserting boundaries. Oftentimes the parent let the child be the decision maker, whereas in uninvolved, the parent was necessarily just not involved in anything or in any of the choices that the child made. So parenting also plays a role when we talk about developing healthy patterns and early lifestyle of the child and how that impacts them down the road. Harmony, the food environment that is around the child. Is it healthy? So an example would be when the families go for grocery shopping. Is the cart filled with healthier foods? Are there more fruits and vegetables, grains, proteins, or is it filled with more packaged foods, food filled with foods that have high levels of preservatives, sodium content? Another question on the side to consider is everyone on board with this? Building this healthy food environment in the house? Is everyone on board with that? Or is there conflict in between parents in terms of what should be purchased for a family's groceries, what should not be purchased, what should be cooked for dinner, what should not be cooked? So really what I'm trying to say is in order to create this healthy environment, you really need everyone on board, and everyone needs to understand the importance of building that environment early on for it to really work. Then we have the other maternal and child factors that we discussed earlier. So when we look at the environment and the family parenting, I wanted to discuss more on that. Yes, parenting styles do play a part on it, but I think it's a little bit more, it's in fact a lot more detail oriented than that. An example is parental misunderstanding about babies' cues. Children during their early years, when they cry for everything, right? Because they're unable to communicate what they want or they need to the parents. So, crying is often the way for a parent to understand baby's anger, their frustration, what exactly they may need. And a lot of times what happens is that the parent translates that cry of the child as a want or need for food. And how that impacts the baby is that babies begin to seek comfort in eating. And that's when that's when it starts to impact them in a negative way. So really just making sure that you're not responding to every single cue from the child when they cry as a want or need for food. Parenting styles definitely have a role to play here, but Bottom line is that when we pamper and incentivize a child with sweet and salty food items for doing chores or for behaving a certain way, that contributes to childhood obesity that are being created from an early age. I gave you an example of shopping patterns and how does a cart really look? Is the buggy full of fruits and vegetables, or is it filled with high caloric foods? Um, and oftentimes we also see where food serves as a reward for desired behavior, and that is often done by parents during the behavioral training of the child for toddler years. A very common example, potty training. You're potty training a child, and every time the child goes and has a successful episode of potty training, you give them a popsicle or you give them a snack. And what they really start to connect is every time I do a good behavior, I should be incentivized with an unhealthy food, and definitely don't want to create that thinking pattern at an early age. I also wanted to look at food advertising and how that really makes a difference. So based on some of the numbers that were discussed in the weight of the nation, the Food Advertising Agency spends about $30 billion each year specifically on advertising, promoting, marketing their food brands, whereas the United States Department of Agriculture combats that with a mere $220 million in nutrition education. Now, I understand that's still a huge budget. $220 million is not a small number by any means. But if you compare the two numbers, we can't compete with the food industry because the USDA's budget is only 2% of the food industry's advertising budget. And as a result, you see these commercials that are trickling down everywhere that are promoting unhealthy foods. I wanted to give you some statistics on that as well. So children see an average of about 12 to 21 TV commercials for food products every day. I mean, these are kids who are watching, TV channels with commercials that, pop up, whatever, every 5 to 10 minutes. It adds up pretty quickly to about 7,600 ads per year per kid. And unfortunately, 98% of the content that is in those ads is filled with foods that are high in fat, sugar, and salt. So none of those are healthier food choices. So when we talk about, again, what contributes to that epidemic, it's the food habits and the household environment that is developed early on in a child's life that makes a huge difference. And kids should not be given large portions of food to eat that are high in salt, sugar, and fat. They should be given more options of fruits and vegetables. Unfortunately, that's the contrary. And within our culture, when we look at a food plate, it's usually filled with large amounts of carbohydrates. It fills with small amounts of proteins, and then even a smaller amount of fruits and vegetables. And that is not how a plate should look. When the above habits are followed with more screen time, common affliction, video games, less physical activity, we have a problem. And parents, yes, they have a huge responsibility and a role to develop a healthy environment from an early age, but the problem is that they can't do it alone, and they're not supposed to do it alone. Why? Because a child's life is impacted by the entire society. We have children who children go to school. They're impacted by the food industry who make those foods for them, the food advertising agency who show some oftentimes very toxic content at very early age to children. So then they all share the equal burden. It's everyone's responsibility to making sure that they do something that does not contribute, or whatever they do, change it in that way that it doesn't contribute to this epidemic. I also wanted to give you a very basic formula of what causes childhood obesity, and hands down it comes to, based on research, the sedentary lifestyle and the unhealthier food choices. If you were to give it a formula, it would be too much of screen time, too much of nutritionally deficient food, so both of those together, plus little to no physical activity. Now, I know it's very basic. It doesn't involve any of the other factors, genetic, race, ethnicity, gender, all of those do play a role. But I wanted to at least give you something very basic that you could take away from this lecture. Also wanted to talk about nutrition transition. So this could be in a way attributed to the increasing industrialization and economic changes that are taking place. Somehow they're leading to a more sedentary working lifestyle and a much more massive change in our food system. It's a macro process that is often called nutrition transition. In this particular slide, I wanted to give you an overview of behaviors that impacts a child's health negatively. It is your responsibility to go through all of those. I have them divided in this slide and in the next slide. And that concludes our lecture. In next class, which is Module 7, that will be posted on Monday, we'll talk about school food policies, healthy eating, and public school food policy change challenges.